It is a striking paradox of our world that the things we build to last forever, monumental stone arches, towering palaces of marble, and sprawling fortresses of iron, are often the very first things to crumble into anonymity under the weight of passing centuries. Meanwhile, the most fragile things we possess, the thin sheets of pressed organic fiber, ink drawn from soot, and delicate silk scrolls containing the fleeting thoughts of ordinary human minds, can outlast entire empires if they are granted the right kind of shelter. Tonight, we travel to a place where this impossible contradiction became reality. We journey to the eastern edge of the Taklamakan Desert, a landscape whose very name translates to, "You go in, but you do not come out." It is an environment of absolute hostility, a shifting ocean of wind-scoured dust and gravel, where daytime temperatures can scorch the skin and nighttime chills can freeze the breath in your throat. Yet it was precisely within this brutal, unforgiving vacuum that humanity's most vulnerable intellectual treasures found their ultimate sanctuary. To understand the immense scale of what occurred here, we must look beyond our modern maps and erase the rigid borders that partition our world today. For over 1,000 years, a vast network of dirt tracks, mountain passes, and desert trails known collectively as the Silk Road served as the central nervous system of human civilization. It stretched across thousands of miles, linking the grand markets of Rome and Byzantium with the imperial courts of Chang'an. Along this perilous highway, goods were not the only things traded. Ideas, philosophies, languages, and hidden spiritual traditions flowed like water through an arid land. At the absolute choke point of this global network, situated at a geographical bottleneck where the terrifying expanse of the desert met the protective wall of the Chilean mountains, sat the ancient oasis city of Dunhuang. To the weary travelers of the ancient world, Dunhuang was a beacon of survival, a place where a natural upwelling of groundwater created a miracle of green vegetation amidst a world of blinding yellow sand. But Dunhuang was far more than just a place to water horses and rest blistered feet. It became a crucible of human thought, a profound meeting ground where cultures that should never have encountered one another intermingled in absolute intimacy. Most histories of this region focus heavily on the grand movements of armies, the shifting fortunes of dynasties, and the violent clashes of rival kingdoms. Tonight, however, we are exploring a different kind of history, a hidden, internal narrative of preservation. We are entering the story of a secret society of scholars, monks, and scribes who recognized that a great storm of political chaos and religious warfare was approaching their beloved oasis. They understood that if they did nothing, the accumulated wisdom of a dozen different civilizations would be erased from the earth forever. In an act of quiet, desperate defiance, they chose to hide the light of human knowledge in the one place where no conquering army would think to look, deep within the darkness of a hollowed-out cliffside. As we begin this journey together, let us allow the hurried pace of our modern lives to dissolve, matching our breath to the slow, rhythmic swaying of an ancient camel caravan moving across the dunes. Imagine the sound of small bronze bells tinkling softly in the cool night air, the gentle whistling of the desert wind over the ridges of the sand, and the deep, profound stillness that settles over the earth when the sun finally sinks below the horizon. We are entering a space where time behaves differently, where a single room can hold the voices of thousands of forgotten souls, waiting in perfect silence for 10 centuries to speak to us once more. This is not a lecture on dates and dry chronologies. It is an invitation to sit by the hearth of history, to feel the textured edge of an ancient manuscript between your fingers, and to contemplate the incredible lengths to which human beings will go to ensure that their stories are not forgotten. What these ancient keepers of knowledge achieved was not an act of sudden, panicked desperation, but rather a masterpiece of deliberate engineering and spiritual devotion. When we think of libraries today, we envision grand buildings with tall windows, organized shelves, and quiet reading rooms open to the public. But the library we are seeking tonight was designed to be completely invisible. It was constructed within a sprawling labyrinth of hand-carved cliffside sanctuaries, known as the Mogao Caves, or the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas. For centuries, Buddhist monks had been carving these small meditation chambers out of the soft conglomerate rock of the Mingsha mountain cliffs. The walls of these caves were not left bare. They were covered from floor to ceiling with breathtakingly vivid frescoes, painted with pigments ground from lapis lazuli, malachite, and cinnabar. Flying celestial beings drifted across the ceilings, while massive, serene statues of clay watched over the dark interiors. Yet, hidden within this massive complex of sacred art lay a secret within a secret. Sometime around the turn of the 11th century, a small group of highly educated men who spoke multiple languages and understood the true value of the written word, realized that their world was fracturing. The Western regions were falling to new rulers who had little respect for the pluralistic heritage of the Silk Road. Libraries in neighboring cities were already burning, their ashes scattered across the dunes. The scholars of Dunhuang looked at their vast collection of scrolls, a library that had been painstakingly gathered and copied over a period of 500 years, and they made a momentous decision. They would not flee with these heavy texts, for the desert would surely claim their lives and their cargo. Instead, they would use one of the existing cave structures, a small side chamber attached to a larger devotional cave, as a time capsule. They did not merely stack the scrolls randomly. They organized them with an extraordinary level of care that reveals their deep reverence for the intellect. They gathered tens of thousands of individual documents, including sacred Buddhist sutras, early Christian liturgies written in Syriac, Hebrew prayers, Taoist treatises, administrative legal documents, medical texts, and even intimate personal letters written by ordinary citizens. They wrapped these precious papers in protective layers of coarse hemp cloth and packed them tightly into neat, catalogued bundles. Then, with a quiet precision that defies the chaos of their era, they built a solid brick wall over the entrance of the small room. To ensure that the concealment was absolute, they plastered over the new brickwork and painted a fresh, seamless fresco directly across its surface, depicting a local wealthy benefactor and a sacred tree. When the plaster dried, the doorway vanished. The secret room became indistinguishable from the rest of the decorated cave wall. For the next 1,000 years, the world outside this hidden chamber underwent a series of cataclysmic transformations. The Silk Road, once the busiest commercial artery on Earth, eventually fell into disuse as maritime trade routes opened up across the oceans. The bustling oasis of Dunhuang slowly shrank, its grand markets falling silent, and its population dwindling to a handful of isolated farmers and caretakers. The great empires that had fought so fiercely for control of this desert corridor, the Tang dynasty, the Tibetan Empire, the Uyghur Khaganate, all dissolved into the dust of history. Generation after generation of local people walked past that specific painted wall in the Mogao Caves, completely unaware that just inches away, separated from them by a thin layer of dried mud and brick, lay a pristine archive of human history. The absolute dryness of the desert air acted as a natural preservative, preventing the fragile paper from rotting, while the deep sand dunes slowly drifted against the cliffside, burying the lower caves and sealing the secret room in total, uninterrupted darkness. This extraordinary preservation forces us to confront a beautiful irony. The very hostility of the Taklamakan Desert, the devastating environment that ruined so many travelers and buried entire cities under mountains of sand, became the sole reason these delicate documents survived. Had these texts remained in the great, comfortable cities of central China or Western Asia, they would have inevitably been consumed by the periodic fires of war, the dampness of changing seasons, or the careless cleaning of subsequent generations. It was only by being cast out into the absolute void, into the silent womb of a desert cliff, that they could endure. As we listen to the quiet murmur of the wind outside, we can almost feel the profound peace of that hidden chamber, where the thoughts of long-dead philosophers, poets, and mystics lay nestled together in the dark, completely safe from the ravages of time. To truly appreciate how this remarkable sanctuary came to hold such a diverse tapestry of human thought, we must step back into the vibrant world that existed before the silence of the sands took over. We must understand that Dunhuang was not always a lonely outpost on the edge of oblivion. It was once a roaring gateway, a frantic and beautiful lung through which the cultures of the East and West breathed in unison. Long before the first brick of the secret chamber was ever laid, this oasis was forged by imperial ambition and the sheer necessity of survival. In the 2nd century before our modern era, the Han Emperor Wu the Great realized that if his empire was to thrive, he had to secure a narrow strip of land known as the Hexi Corridor. This thin geographical line, squeezed between the high, frozen plateaus of Tibet and the unforgiving wastes of the Gobi Desert, was the only viable path connecting China to the mysterious Western world. By establishing Dunhuang at the westernmost tip of this corridor, the emperor effectively created a harbor on the edge of a dry ocean, a place where civilization could brace itself before plunging into the unknown. As we imagine this ancient landscape, let the vastness of the geography settle over your mind. Picture Dunhuang as a sprawling, chaotic metropolis of low, sun-baked mud brick buildings, surrounded by a brilliant patchwork of irrigated green fields, orchards of sweet melons, and groves of whispering poplar trees. This green sanctuary was fed by the pure, melted snows rushing down from the distant, jagged peaks of the Chilean mountains. The water flowed through an intricate network of hand-dug canals, transforming what should have been a lifeless dust bowl into an agricultural miracle. For a traveler arriving from the west, who had spent months navigating the terrifying, wind-scoured tracks of the Pamir Mountains and the waterless voids of the desert, the sight of Dunhuang rising on the horizon was nothing short of a resurrection. It was a place where you could finally unbuckle your heavy iron armor, wash the bitter salt from your eyes, and sleep without the constant, gnawing fear of being buried alive by a midnight sandstorm. Because every single soul traveling along the Silk Road was forced to pass through this narrow bottleneck, Dunhuang became a magnificent, fluid crossroads where the concept of a homogeneous culture completely dissolved. On any given afternoon, the crowded marketplaces of the city would have resembled a living ethnological museum. We would have heard the sharp, guttural tones of Sogdian merchants negotiating the price of raw silk, their voices mingling with the soft, melodic cadences of classical Chinese scholars reciting poetry. We would have seen fair-haired, blue-eyed traders from the distant remnants of the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms, walking shoulder to shoulder with dark-skinned, linen-wrapped pilgrims from the river valleys of northern India. Persian metalworkers, who carried the refined artistic traditions of the Sasanian court, set up their workshops next to nomadic Central Asian horse archers, whose ancestors had roamed the Eurasian steppes for generations. In this environment, diversity was not an abstract social ideal. It was the daily reality of commerce and survival. This constant, intense collision of humanity meant that Dunhuang was a place where intellectual curiosity was naturally woven into the fabric of everyday life. When people trade goods, they inevitably trade the stories that give those goods meaning. A merchant selling a bolt of brilliantly dyed saffron cloth from Samarkand would also tell the story of the ancient king who favored that color, or the local spiritual master who wore it during his meditations. A diplomat carrying official scrolls from the imperial court in Chang'an would bring with him the latest philosophical commentaries on Confucius and Lao Tzu, which would then be eagerly debated by local scholars over cups of hot, spiced tea. This was an environment completely free from the rigid provincialism that characterized many other ancient cities. In Dunhuang, to meet someone who looked different, spoke an unfamiliar tongue, or prayed to a different god was not a cause for alarm. It was an opportunity for learning, an invitation to expand one's understanding of the cosmos. As the centuries rolled on, this intellectual openness allowed Dunhuang to transform from a simple military garrison and trading post into one of the most significant spiritual centers of the ancient world. Religion in this oasis was not a tool of division, but a shared language of seeking. The most prominent spiritual force to arrive along these trade paths was Buddhism, which traveled northward from India along the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. For the early Buddhist missionaries, Dunhuang was the perfect staging ground. Here they found a population that was deeply aware of the fragility of human life, a natural consequence of living on the edge of a deadly desert. The Buddhist message of impermanence, of the interconnectedness of all living things, and the path toward liberation from suffering resonated deeply with people who watched the sand dunes shift and change with every passing gust of wind. Yet, as Buddhism took root in the fertile soil of the oasis, it did not seek to violently eradicate the spiritual traditions that had arrived before it, or those that would come later. Instead, it entered into a long, slow, and beautiful conversation with them. The local Taoist sages found common ground with the Buddhist monks, noting the striking similarities between the concept of the Tao, the unnameable, flowing source of all existence, and the Buddhist concept of Dharma. When Christian missionaries belonging to the Church of the East, often referred to as Nestorian Christians, arrived from Persia carrying Syriac liturgies and images of a luminous cross, they were welcomed into the city's intellectual circles with the same respect granted to any other traveling scholars. Even Jewish traders, who traveled the long routes with Hebrew texts tucked into their leather saddlebags, found a place where their sacred scripts were honored as valuable repositories of ancient wisdom. This peaceful coexistence was not born out of a lack of conviction, but rather from a profound, shared realization that human knowledge and spiritual striving were precious, universal treasures that belonged to all of mankind. The scholars of Dunhuang possessed a rare, cosmopolitan mindset that was centuries ahead of its time. They did not view the world through a binary lens of believers and infidels, of civilized citizens and outer barbarians. To them, a beautifully written manuscript, whether it was a translation of an Indian philosophical treatise, a Persian astronomical chart, or a local census recording the names of ordinary farmers, was an object of intrinsic, almost holy value. They understood that every text was a fragile bridge built across the vast abyss of time, connecting one human mind to another. It was this deep collective reverence for the written word that laid the unseen foundations for the great work of preservation that would take place centuries later. The people of Dunhuang were, by their very nature, a community of collectors, translators, and guardians. They spent their lives surrounded by a swirling sea of languages: Sogdian, Khotanese, Tocharian, Tibetan, Sanskrit, and Old Turkic, and they recognized that languages could die just as easily as men. They knew that when a language vanishes, an entire way of seeing the universe is lost along with it. Therefore, the act of copying a text, of translating it accurately from one tongue to another, and of storing it safely away from the dampness of rain and the destructive greed of men, was viewed as the highest form of virtue. It was a sacred duty, a quiet labor of love, performed not for personal fame or political power, but for the benefit of generations yet unborn. As we rest in the quiet comfort of the present moment, let us visualize the physical reality of this ancient oasis during its golden age. Imagine the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the courtyard of a bustling Dunhuang monastery. In the center of the yard, a group of traveling monks from different corners of the earth are sitting together on woven reed mats. They do not share a native language, yet they are communicating through a shared knowledge of classical characters, drawing symbols in the fine dust of the ground with smooth wooden sticks. They are comparing their versions of a sacred text, arguing gently over the precise translation of a single word describing the nature of the soul. Nearby, the smell of roasting cumin, fresh flatbread, and sweet incense drifts through the air, while the distant, rhythmic thud of a blacksmith's hammer provides a steady heartbeat for the city. This was the vibrant, interconnected world that gave birth to the treasures of the caves, a world where the accumulation of human knowledge was seen as a collective, global masterpiece, a magnificent tower of thought built upon the shared sands of the desert. As the spiritual and intellectual life of the oasis reached its magnificent zenith, the vibrant energy of the crowded city streets began to overflow into the surrounding landscape, seeking a more permanent, silent monument to its devotion. A short distance outside the city walls, where the green fields abruptly surrendered to the immense, looming presence of the Mingsha sand dunes, a long, sheer cliff face rose above a small river valley. This cliffside, carved over millennia by the seasonal rushing of the Dunhuang River, was made of a coarse, fragile gravel conglomerate, a stone too soft for grand architecture, yet perfectly suited for a different kind of creative miracle. It was here, in the year 366 of our modern era, that a wandering Buddhist monk named Luzun experienced a profound vision that would alter the destiny of the desert forever. As he rested at the base of the cliff at twilight, looking up at the jagged ridges of rock, he suddenly saw the entire cliff face illuminated by a brilliant, ethereal glow, as if 1,000 golden Buddhas were floating in the air, bathed in celestial light. Deeply moved by this mystical encounter, Luzun did not return to the comforts of the city. Instead, he took a simple iron chisel and mallet and began to hollow out a small chamber directly into the face of the cliff. It was a modest, quiet act of individual meditation, a physical anchoring of his vision into the living earth. He could not have known that his solitary labor would initiate a monumental creative movement that would endure for more than 7 continuous centuries. Soon, other hermits, monks, and spiritual seekers followed his example, carving their own small sanctuaries into the stone. Over generations, this collective effort transformed the silent, barren cliffside into a sprawling, multi-tiered labyrinth of sacred spaces, a vertical city of the spirit that eventually grew to encompass nearly 500 distinct caves. These chambers were known to history as the Mogao Caves, a name that beautifully translates to the caves where there is nothing higher. To comprehend the sheer physical reality of creating these sanctuaries, we must abandon our modern concepts of construction and imagine the immense, exhausting labor required by every single cubic inch of hollowed space. These caves were not built from the ground up. They were literally subtracted from the mountain. Teams of ordinary laborers, working by the dim, flickering light of small oil lamps filled with pungent sesame oil, stood on crude wooden scaffolding suspended over the rocky canyon floor. Hour after hour, day after day, they swung heavy iron picks into the dense gravel stone, their lungs breathing in a constant, choking cloud of fine gray dust. They had to move with an extraordinary blend of brute force and extreme caution, for the conglomerate rock was notoriously unstable, prone to sudden, disastrous cave-ins that could bury a crew of workers in a single, terrifying instant. Once the rough geometry of a chamber was successfully carved out, whether it was a tiny, claustrophobic cell designed for a single meditating hermit, or a massive, cathedral-like hall intended for communal chanting, the true artistic transformation could begin. Because the natural gravel wall was too rough and pitted to accept paint, a highly specialized group of artisans had to prepare the canvas of the cave. They mixed a thick, smooth plaster using the fine silt gathered from the nearby riverbed. Combining it with chopped straw, animal hair, and wild plant fibers to give it strength and flexibility. They applied this dark mud plaster over the stone in several layers, carefully smoothing it with flat wooden trowels until the uneven rock was completely concealed beneath a flawless, velvety skin of pale clay. This preparation was a crucial science. If the plaster dried too quickly in the arid desert air, it would crack and peel away, destroying months of labor before a single drop of ink could touch its surface. While the plasterers worked on the walls, other artisans were busy creating the heart of each sanctuary, the magnificent, life-sized statues of spiritual figures that would inhabit the darkness. Because the local stone was too brittle to be sculpted into freestanding figures, the artists developed a unique, highly sophisticated technique of clay modeling. They constructed a skeleton, or armature, out of bundles of reeds, wooden branches, and thick hemp ropes, shaping the rough proportions of the figure. Over this hidden framework, they applied successive layers of fine clay, gradually sculpting the delicate folds of silk robes, the intricate details of heavy jewelry, and the serene, timeless contours of the human face. The final layer of clay was mixed with mineral pigments and polished with smooth river stones, creating statues that possessed a startling, lifelike presence, figures that seemed to breathe and radiate a quiet, comforting warmth within the cool shadows of the cave. The painting of the murals was perhaps the most intellectually demanding phase of the entire enterprise. The artists who worked in these caves were not mere decorators. They were visual theologians, masters of an incredibly complex language of symbols, narratives, and cosmological maps. Working in cramped, awkward positions, often balanced precariously on tall ladders, with their heads tilted back toward the ceiling, they painted by the illumination of small bronze mirrors that reflected a single, precious beam of natural sunlight into the depths of the cave. They worked with mineral-based paints that were imported from across the known world. Brilliant blues made from Afghan lapis lazuli, vivid greens from local malachite, deep reds from cinnabar mined in central China, and delicate gold leaf beaten so thin that it would float away on a breath. These expensive materials were bound together with animal glue, creating an enamel-like paint that was completely immune to the fading effects of time, preserving its rich brilliance for centuries. As we wander through these painted chambers in our minds, let us look closely at the stories that cover every square millimeter of the walls. The murals did not depict terrifying, distant deities, but rather a profoundly compassionate, interconnected cosmos. We see endless panoramic landscapes filled with rolling green hills, winding rivers, and grand palaces with sweeping tiled roofs. Within these landscapes, the artists illustrated the Jataka tales, the legendary stories of the Buddha's previous lifetimes, where he appeared as a golden deer, a noble king, or a majestic bird, always sacrificing his own well-being to protect the weak and the suffering. These stories were designed to be read like a visual scroll, guiding the viewer's eye in a slow, meditative circle around the perimeter of the room, filling the mind with a sense of profound empathy and ethical responsibility. Yet, what makes the Mogao Caves truly unique is how they captured the exquisite, fleeting details of contemporary secular life along the Silk Road. The artists could not help but include the world they saw outside the caves every day. Amidst the celestial beings and flying deities drifting across the ceilings, they painted detailed scenes of ordinary human existence. We can look at these walls today and see ancient farmers guiding wooden plows behind teams of lumbering oxen, merchants standing in crowded bazaars, holding up bolts of pattern-dyed textiles, musicians playing delicate stringed lutes and horizontal harps, and weary travelers resting beside their heavily laden camels under the shade of a willow tree. It was a complete, living record of an entire civilization, captured with a level of intimacy and psychological truth that no written history textbook could ever hope to replicate. The funding for these magnificent sanctuaries did not come from a single imperial treasury, but from a vast, diverse coalition of society. Every cave was a collective act of community sponsorship. Wealthy governors, royal families, and powerful military commanders funded the largest, most spectacular halls to demonstrate their piety and secure their legacy. But right alongside these grand monuments were tiny, unadorned caves paid for by humble associations of ordinary citizens, cooperatives of local silk weavers, butchers, illiterate soldiers, and traveling cart drivers who pooled their modest savings to hire an artist to paint a single small image of a protective deity on a wall. For these ordinary people, contributing to the caves was a form of cosmic insurance, a way to anchor their souls to a place of absolute safety and spiritual merit in a world that was constantly shifting beneath their feet. As the night deepens, imagine standing inside one of these completed sanctuaries at the end of a long day of labor. The sound of the chisels has finally ceased, and the artisans have returned to the city, leaving the cave to its eternal inhabitants. The air inside is cool, dry, and smells faintly of damp earth, fresh glue, and the sweet, resinous scent of burning incense. The flame of a single oil lamp flickers gently in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows across the painted walls. As the light moves, the figures on the wall seem to come alive. The painted robes of the celestial beings appear to flutter in an unfelt breeze, and the calm, painted eyes of the clay statues seem to follow you with a gaze of profound, unconditional understanding. This was the magnificent artistic womb that would soon become the ultimate guardian of human knowledge, a place where the highest achievements of human art and the deepest longings of the human spirit were carved directly into the ancient bone of the desert. While the painters and clay sculptors were transforming the stone walls of the Mogao complex into a vibrant visual paradise, another group of dedicated souls was quietly at work in the deep shadows of the monasteries, engaged in a far more silent and meticulous form of creation. These were the scribes, the scholars, and the professional copyists who inhabited the ancient scriptoria of Dunhuang. If the caves themselves were the physical temples of this desert culture, the written manuscripts were its living soul, the vital vessels that carried the precise thoughts, prayers, and administrative structures of the Silk Road across the boundaries of time. To understand the rhythm of life in these hidden workshops, we must look past the grand historical narratives of empires and focus our attention on the small, repetitive actions that filled the waking hours of an ancient intellectual class, a world defined by the scratch of a reed pen, the dark sheen of fresh ink, and the slow, methodical unrolling of long sheets of paper. To produce a single manuscript in this era was an intensive, multi-layered craft that required a deep harmony between natural chemistry and human discipline. It began long before a pen ever touched a surface, with the manufacturing of the paper itself. The papermakers of Dunhuang utilized the raw materials of their environment, gathering the inner bark of mulberry trees, tough hemp rags, and wild desert grasses. These materials were soaked in river water, boiled in large iron vats with wood ash, and pounded with heavy wooden mallets until the tough plant structures dissolved into a smooth, fibrous pulp. This slurry was then scooped up using fine bamboo screens, allowing the water to drain away and leaving behind a thin, wet mat of interlocking fibers. Once dried on sun-baked mud walls and smoothed with polished heavy shells, this paper was treated with a pale yellow dye extracted from the Amur cork tree. This chemical treatment was not an aesthetic choice. The dye contained natural insect-repelling properties that protected the precious organic fiber from being consumed by bookworms and termites, a vital precaution that ensured the documents would survive for a millennium. Inside the quiet scriptoria, the atmosphere was one of intense, meditative focus, a space where the act of writing was elevated to the level of a high spiritual ritual. The scribes sat on low, woven cushions or knelt before small wooden desks that were tilted slightly toward the light of narrow windows. Each writer possessed a personalized set of tools: a smooth stone ink slab, a stick of solid black ink formed from the soot of burned pine wood mixed with animal glue, and a collection of delicate brushes made from fine rabbit hair, wolf fur, or the stiff whiskers of mice. Before beginning their daily work, a scribe would pour a few drops of water onto the stone slab and slowly grind the ink stick in a circular motion. This repetitive, rhythmic action served as a crucial transition for the mind, a moment of quiet centering that allowed the writer to leave behind the distractions of the outside world and enter a state of complete, unhurried absorption. The daily output of these scriptoria was astonishingly diverse, reflecting the vast, multilingual reality of the oasis. A professional scribe had to be a master of calligraphic discipline, capable of maintaining absolute consistency in the size, weight, and spacing of characters over hundreds of thousands of words. In the copying of Buddhist sutras, for instance, every line was precisely measured, with standard formats of 17 characters per column. The writer would hold the brush vertically, their wrists suspended above the paper without touching it, drawing each stroke with a breath controlled and steady. A single error, a misplaced drop of ink, or a moment of wandering attention could invalidate days of exhausting labor. To minimize mistakes, teams of proofreaders and senior scholars sat at the back of the scriptoria, carefully comparing the newly copied scrolls against master texts, adding small red correction marks between the lines to ensure absolute textual purity. As we look closer into this silent world, we discover that the scribes were not detached, mechanical instruments. They were real human beings who left their personal emotions, weariness, and hopes embedded within the margins of their sacred work. At the very end of long, grand philosophical treatises, it was common for a scribe to write a short, informal postscript, or colophon. These intimate additions provide a heartbreakingly beautiful window into the daily reality of their lives. A scribe writing in the freezing chill of a desert winter might add a small line saying, "My fingers are so cold I can no longer hold the brush. May whoever reads this forgive my clumsy script." Another writer, having finished a massive project that took many months, might include a touching prayer for his family. "I dedicate the merit of copying this holy book to my aging mother, that her sickness may be healed, and to my deceased father, that his soul may find peace in the Western paradise." The economic and social ecosystem that supported this vast writing industry was deeply intertwined with the spiritual beliefs of the community. In this ancient society, commissioning the copying of a text was considered an act of immense karmic virtue, a way to generate spiritual merit that could protect a person from misfortune, illness, or a bad rebirth. A wealthy merchant, about to embark on a perilous 2-year journey across the shifting sands of the Taklamakan Desert, would visit a monastery and pay a substantial sum to have a protective scripture copied in his name. The completed scroll would then be dedicated to a specific deity, stamped with the merchant's personal seal, and placed safely into the monastic library. It was a form of spiritual transaction, a tangible anchoring of human hope and anxiety into a physical object that would endure long after the traveler had departed. This constant, intense demand for texts transformed the monasteries of Dunhuang into massive repositories of human knowledge, functioning as the great public libraries, universities, and historical archives of their era. The scrolls were not allowed to pile up in chaotic heaps. They were managed with an advanced system of archival science that rivals our modern library networks. The manuscripts were pasted together into long, continuous scrolls that could measure up to 30 or 40 feet in length, wrapped around smooth, wooden rollers. These scrolls were then organized by subject matter and language, tucked into protective wrappers made of woven grass mats or dyed silk, and fitted with small bamboo tags that hung from the edges. These tags contained brief titles and catalog numbers, allowing a monastic librarian to quickly locate a specific document within a collection that numbered in the tens of thousands without having to unroll a single sheet of paper. As we envision the daily operation of these libraries, let us remember that the preservation of knowledge here was an active, defensive battle against the elements. Every summer, during the brief window of hot, dry weather, the librarians would initiate a grand ritual known as airing the books. Thousands of long scrolls would be carried out into the bright sunshine of the monastery courtyards and unrolled across long wooden tables or clean straw mats. This process allowed the dry desert air to circulate through the fibers of the paper, driving out any lingering traces of moisture that might encourage mold and exposing the inner sheets to the light to discourage insects. It was a joyful, communal event that brought together monks, novices, and lay scholars in a shared, reverent effort to care for their intellectual inheritance, treating each scroll with the tenderness one might show to a fragile, living child. Let yourself rest now in the deep, undisturbed peace of this ancient library landscape as twilight begins to fall over the oasis. The busy scriptoria have closed their doors for the night, and the busy scratching of the pens has dissolved into the absolute silence of the evening. The thousands of completed scrolls sit neatly side by side on their dark wooden shelves, wrapped in their protective silk coverings, their small bamboo tags swaying gently in the cool breeze that sneaks through the monastery windows. Each one of these silent rolls contains the concentrated life energy of a human being who sat for hours in the light, pouring their intellect, their skill, and their deepest spiritual longings onto a fragile piece of paper. This was a library that was alive, an unparalleled ocean of words and ideas that was quietly rising to its highest volume, completely unaware that a dark curtain of historical chaos was about to descend upon the world outside, turning this active sanctuary into a silent tomb of hidden truths. To truly step into the heart of this ancient library, we must look beyond the overwhelming presence of Buddhist texts and explore the breathtaking, multicolored spiritual landscape that shared these wooden shelves. In our modern understanding of history, we often view different world religions as rigid, isolated islands that developed in absolute separation, frequently meeting only on the violent field of battle. But within the quiet sanctuaries of Dunhuang, this divisive logic completely broke down. The library that was quietly accumulating in the desert was not a dogmatic fortress built to exclude outsiders. It was a vast, harmonious symphony of forgotten faiths. Here, within the very same bundles of hemp cloth, texts from completely different theological universes lay nested together in absolute peace, creating an ecumenical archive that is entirely unique in the history of human civilization. As we imagine unrolling these ancient scrolls, let us think about the incredible journeys these ideas took to reach this desert oasis. Alongside the beautifully preserved Chinese translations of Indian Buddhist philosophy, the librarians cared for manuscripts that carried the voice of early Christian mystics. These were not the Latin or Greek texts of Western Europe, but the precious records of the Church of the East, written in the elegant, flowing characters of the Syriac script. These Christians had traveled thousands of miles from the river valleys of Syria and Persia, moving along the trade routes with their sacred liturgies tucked into their woolen robes. When they arrived in Dunhuang, they did not build exclusive, closed enclaves. Instead, they collaborated with local Buddhist and Taoist scholars to translate their sacred stories into terms that the people of Asia could understand, using the beautiful vocabulary of the East to describe the life of Jesus, whom they referred to as the luminous Messiah. In this atmosphere of profound intellectual sharing, the boundaries between different faiths became beautifully fluid, resulting in texts that read like a creative dialogue between entirely different worlds. A Christian text found within the collection might describe the virtues of a holy life using traditional Buddhist concepts, explaining that to follow the teachings of Christ is to achieve freedom from the heavy chains of desire and karmic consequence. Conversely, Taoist treatises concerning the cultivation of the inner life, the pursuit of longevity, and the alignment of the human spirit with the natural rhythms of the universe were copied with the same meticulous precision granted to any imperial decree. The scholars of Dunhuang recognized that though the names of the deities and the shapes of the alphabets differed, the underlying human search for meaning, for comfort in the face of mortality, and for a connection to the divine was a universal thread that bound all of humanity together. But the diversity of this hidden archive stretched even further, touching ancient traditions that have long since vanished from the active memory of our world. Nestled deep within the bundles were rare, beautifully illuminated manuscripts belonging to Manichaeism, a fascinating, highly complex religion founded in 3rd century Persia by the prophet Mani. Manichaeism viewed the entire cosmos as a grand, eternal cosmic struggle between the forces of absolute light and absolute darkness, teaching that the human soul is a brilliant spark of light trapped within the heavy material prison of the physical body. In Europe and the Mediterranean world, this faith was brutally persecuted, its books hunted down and burned until almost every trace of its existence was utterly wiped out. Yet here, on the distant edge of the Taklamakan Desert, their sacred texts found a safe harbor, written in Sogdian and Old Turkic, preserved with their vivid, multicolored illustrations of celestial realms completely intact. Even the ancient faith of Israel found its quiet echo within this multilingual sanctuary. Among the thousands of documents was a single, fragile sheet of paper containing a Hebrew prayer, written by a Jewish merchant who had stopped at the oasis to rest his caravan. This document was not a grand theological treatise, but a deeply personal, intimate plea for protection, written in a clear, practiced hand. It serves as a poignant reminder that the Library of Dunhuang was not just an academic institution for elite scholars. It was a living mirror of the entire human experience along the Silk Road. Every traveler who passed through the city left a tiny piece of their soul embedded in the paper, creating an archive that was simultaneously local and global, deeply spiritual and intensely practical. As we contemplate this incredible gathering of faiths, we must realize that this peaceful coexistence was made possible by a highly advanced, pluralistic worldview that was shared by the political and religious leaders of the oasis. The governors of Dunhuang understood that the survival of their city depended entirely on its ability to welcome everyone. If a merchant felt that his religion was disrespected or his sacred texts were treated with contempt, he would simply choose a different route, taking his valuable silks, spices, and taxes to a rival market. Tolerance, therefore, was not just an enlightened moral stance. It was the lifeblood of the oasis's economy. The monasteries themselves became neutral zones, places where a Persian Christian, a Tibetan Buddhist, a Chinese Taoist, and a Central Asian Manichaean could sit down together in the shade of a courtyard, share a meal of dried figs and tea, and look at each other's books with an attitude of profound curiosity rather than suspicion. This remarkable intellectual openness had a profound impact on the work of the scribes who populated the scriptoria. Many of these writers were highly skilled linguists who spent their entire lives translating texts between languages that possessed completely different structures and cultural assumptions. To translate a complex Sanskrit philosophical concept into classical Chinese, for instance, required a deep, empathetic understanding of both worlds. The scribes could not simply replace one word with another. They had to invent new characters, create poetic metaphors, and build conceptual bridges that allowed ideas to travel safely across the linguistic chasm. In doing so, they developed a rare form of universal literacy, an intellectual flexibility that allowed them to appreciate the intrinsic beauty and value of an idea, regardless of the cultural garment it happened to wear. Let us sit with the magnificent, quiet weight of this realization for a moment. In an era when Western Europe was entering a period of deep provincialism, where libraries were shrinking and the knowledge of foreign languages was becoming a rarity, this small oasis in the heart of Asia was operating as a vast, global mind. The shelves of Dunhuang held the distilled wisdom of ancient Greece, India, Persia, China, and the Middle East, all bound together by the common medium of yellow-dyed paper and black pine soot ink. It was an unparalleled monument to human intelligence, a place where the collective thoughts of our species were being gathered into a single, magnificent archive, as if humanity was subconsciously preparing a grand summary of everything it had learned before the long dark of winter set in. The preservation of these diverse texts within a single collection is what gives the story of Dunhuang its deep, almost mystical resonance. It reminds us that there was once a time and a place where the great religions of the world did not view each other through the distorted lens of fear and conflict, but as companions in a shared, difficult journey through the desert of existence. The manuscripts did not argue with one another on the shelves. The Christian cross, the Buddhist wheel of the law, the Manichaean tree of light, and the Hebrew script rested side by side in the darkness, maintaining a silent, sacred vigil. They were all waiting together, bound by a shared destiny of concealment, completely unaware that the world outside their quiet sanctuary was beginning to fracture into pieces, and that the peaceful, cosmopolitan era that had created them was about to be swept away by the brutal currents of an approaching historical storm. The serene and harmonious world that had turned Dunhuang into a global mind was not destined to remain undisturbed forever. For history is a restless river that eventually floods even the most isolated sanctuaries. As the 10th century drew toward its close, the golden age of the Silk Road began to suffer from the slow, agonizing friction of systemic collapse. The great Tang dynasty, which had long served as the ultimate guarantor of peace and stability across the Chinese Empire, dissolved into a chaotic, fragmented landscape of competing warlords and short-lived regional kingdoms. Without the protective shield of imperial armies and the reliable funding of the central court, the long trade routes became increasingly treacherous, infested with bandits, and subjected to the erratic, heavy taxes of localized tyrants. The lifeblood of Dunhuang, the constant flowing river of wealthy merchant caravans, foreign diplomats, and wandering scholars, began to dry up, leaving the oasis increasingly isolated on the edge of a rapidly darkening geopolitical horizon. To understand the creeping anxiety that began to grip the monastic community of the Mogao Caves, we must look at the shifting map of Central Asia during this turbulent epoch. Dunhuang found itself caught in a vice between rising, highly aggressive empires that possessed none of the pluralistic tolerance that had defined the oasis for centuries. To the southwest, the Tibetan Empire, which had briefly occupied and patronized Dunhuang, was fracturing into internal conflict, while to the north, the nomadic Uyghur Khaganate was constantly shifting its alliances. But the most terrifying threat emerged from the far west, from the rising power of the Karakhanid Khanate. This newly Islamicized Turkic empire was launching a series of relentless, fiercely ideological military campaigns across the desert, systematically conquering the ancient Buddhist kingdoms of Khotan and Kashgar, destroying their monasteries and burning their extensive libraries to the ground in a campaign of absolute cultural eradication. As news of these distant catastrophes trickled into Dunhuang with the arrival of exhausted, terrified refugees, the monks and scholars realized that the geographic isolation that had long protected them was becoming a deadly trap. The rumors were precise and horrifying. The great centers of translation in Kashgar were gone. The sacred wooden statues of Khotan had been chopped up for firewood, and the ancient scrolls of the western oases were being thrown into rivers or scattered across the sand to be destroyed by the wind. The scholars of Dunhuang understood that they were looking at their own inevitable future. Their city was no longer a vibrant crossroads. It was an endangered island, an architectural and intellectual relic of a cosmopolitan world that was being violently erased by a new era of rigid, uncompromising religious warfare. This atmosphere of approaching doom created a profound psychological shift within the scriptoria and libraries of the Mogao complex. The daily work of the scribes, which had once been a confident celebration of cultural sharing and spiritual merit, transformed into a desperate race against time. The rhythm of the pens became frantic, yet the copyists refused to compromise the exquisite quality of their script. They were no longer just translating texts for traveling merchants. They were trying to create a complete, durable duplicate of their entire civilization before the fire reached their gates. Every line drawn by a wolf-hair brush was an act of quiet resistance against the approaching darkness, an attempt to anchor the fragile memories of humanity onto sheets of paper that felt thinner and more vulnerable with each passing day. We can feel the heavy weight of this historical tension if we imagine the late-night conversations taking place within the private chambers of the senior monastic administrators. These men were not naive hermits cut off from reality. They were highly educated statesmen who read the diplomatic dispatches and understood the brutal mathematics of military power. They knew that Dunhuang's small garrison stood no chance against the battle-hardened cavalry of the Karakhanids if the invaders chose to march eastward. They looked at their vast collection of manuscripts, the irreplaceable, multilingual archive that had taken half a millennium to accumulate, and they realized that its very existence was a death sentence. If the city fell, these buildings would be looted, and the papers would be used to light the campfires of the conquering army. It is during this period of intense, suffocating vulnerability that the concept of structural irony becomes painfully clear. The very success of Dunhuang, the immense wealth and prestige that had allowed it to gather the finest library in all of Asia, had created an archive so massive that it was completely impossible to move. A collection of tens of thousands of long, heavy paper scrolls, packed into wooden crates, would require a caravan of hundreds of camels to transport. In a world tearing itself apart at the seams, where every mountain pass was controlled by raiders and every well was a battleground, attempting to flee with the library would mean its immediate destruction in the deep desert. The scholars were forced to confront a heartbreaking paradox. Their greatest treasure had become an immobile anchor, a magnificent monument that could neither defend itself nor run away from the storm. This realization shifted the focus of the community from active preservation to absolute secrecy. They understood that if the library was to survive, it could not be defended by walls of stone or swords of iron. It had to be protected by the powerful armor of total oblivion. They had to find a way to make this immense mountain of human knowledge completely disappear from the face of the earth, while keeping it physically located within the very complex that the enemy would undoubtedly search. It was a strategy of supreme psychological daring, a gamble that required them to trust that the deep, shifting sands and the vast emptiness of the desert would become their ultimate allies in a game of hide-and-seek that would last for centuries. As the political situation deteriorated further, the community began to implement a careful, systematic plan to prepare the caves for a period of extended abandonment. The regular public ceremonies in the grand halls became less frequent, and the wealthy benefactors who had once proudly funded new construction projects withdrew their money to secure their own private fortresses. The artists who had filled the chambers with brilliant mineral colors packed up their pigments and fled to safer provinces in the east. A profound, melancholy quiet settled over the canyon of the Dunhuang River. The multi-tiered wooden walkways that connected the caves, once crowded with the colorful robes of international pilgrims and the busy chatter of students, now echoed only with the lonely, hollow footsteps of a dwindling group of aging caretakers. Let us pause for a moment in the cool, gathering darkness of this declining era and feel the atmosphere of a world preparing to close its eyes. The desert wind is blowing harder now, carrying with it a constant, fine grit that scratches against the beautifully painted wooden facades of the caves. The poplars along the riverbank are shedding their leaves, their bare branches rattling like dry bones in the night air. In the scriptoria, the oil lamps are burning low, their dim light illuminating the anxious faces of the remaining scholars as they look out toward the western horizon, where the dust storms rise like columns of smoke from distant burning cities. The magnificent civilization of the Silk Road was breathing its final, shallow breaths, and the stage was being set for a quiet, monumental act of sacrifice, a decision that would seal the fate of these ancient voices, burying them deep within the silent heart of the cliffside, where the world would completely forget their names for 1,000 years. The encroaching shadow of geopolitical ruin did not cause a panic among the remaining guardians of Dunhuang. Instead, it summoned forth a profound, icy clarity. In the first few years of the 11th century, as the neighboring Tangut Empire began to push its borders toward the oasis, a tiny, tightly knit circle of senior scholars, high-ranking monks, and master archivists converged within the absolute privacy of Cave 16. This specific cave was a magnificent, vaulted temple room, its walls completely covered with elegant frescoes of meditative deities sitting upon intricate lotus thrones. But these men had not gathered to pray or to chant sacred verses. They met to finalize a plan that was as radical as it was quiet. They had collectively arrived at a momentous conclusion. The active era of their library was over. The books could no longer serve as an open fountain of daily instruction for the community. To save the knowledge itself, they had to transform their living library into an airtight, invisible tomb. To truly understand the psychological weight of this choice, we must realize that these scholars were preparing to bury their own life's work. They were not distant historical actors looking back on a completed epic. They were the very men who had spent decades copying these characters, smoothing the paper, and correcting the translations. To lock these manuscripts away meant willingly severing their own connection to the intellectual world, plunging their most cherished spiritual companions into total, permanent darkness. Yet, there was no hesitation in their deliberations. Their perspective was grounded in a civilizational timescale. They understood that while their individual lives were short and the current political storm was fierce, paper could wait. If they concealed the texts perfectly, the truths contained within them would remain completely pristine, untouched by the fires of religious fanaticism or the damp rot of human neglect, surviving to speak to a future age that might once again value the pluralistic heritage of the Silk Road. The choosing of the specific location for this hidden archive was a masterpiece of subtle architectural strategy. Rather than digging a completely new, deeply buried cavern from scratch, an operation that would have generated massive mounds of telltale gravel dust and instantly alerted the local population, the conspirators selected an existing side chamber that branched off from the entry corridor of Cave 16. This smaller room had been constructed decades earlier as a commemorative funerary chapel for a highly respected local monk named Hong Bien, who had served as the spiritual leader of Dunhuang during a previous era of Tibetan rule. A beautiful, lifelike clay statue of Hong Bien sat upon a low platform inside the room, his serene eyes looking toward the entrance, while the walls behind him were decorated with delicate paintings of sacred trees and attentive attendants. It was an incredibly holy, private space, a room that ordinary people would rarely enter out of deep, traditional respect for the dead. By choosing this specific memorial chapel, the scholars took advantage of a brilliant psychological shield. No invading soldier or local looter looking for gold would think to search a small, quiet funeral alcove that appeared to contain nothing but a single clay statue of a dead monk. But before the room could be sealed, an immense, exhausting logistical operation had to be executed in absolute, dead-of-night silence. The scholars and a few deeply trusted novice monks began the process of transferring the contents of the great monastic libraries into this single, cramped chamber. They did not simply dump the scrolls into the room in a chaotic, panicked pile. They treated every single scrap of paper with the same tender reverence that a mother would show to a sleeping child, maintaining a strict archival discipline under the most terrifying pressure. Let your mind step into the physical reality of that dark subterranean workshop during those final frantic nights. The air inside the cave corridor is thick with the smell of old paper, coarse hemp, and the sharp, smoky aroma of burning animal fat from small bronze lamps. The scholars move like ghosts through the shadows, their bare feet making no sound on the smooth mud floors. They carry large, heavy bundles wrapped in protective layers of rough, unpainted cloth. Inside each bundle, dozens of long paper scrolls are tightly packed together, organized by language, subject, and historical era. The collection is breathtakingly vast. Thousands of scrolls of the Lotus Sutra, rare medical treatises on the properties of desert herbs, ancient legal contracts detailing the sale of water rights along the canals, exquisite Christian prayers translated into classical Chinese, and Manichaean hymns celebrating the ultimate triumph of cosmic light over darkness. As the bundles are carefully stacked inside Hongbian's chapel, the physical challenge of space becomes increasingly acute. The room is tiny, measuring only about 9 feet square and less than 10 feet high. The scholars must utilize every square inch of available space, stacking the cloth-wrapped packages from the floor all the way up to the curved ceiling, creating a dense, solid wall of compacted human thought. They are forced to remove Hongbian's beloved clay statue from its original position, gently sliding it out into the main corridor of Cave 16 to make room for the final, most precious crates of manuscripts. There is a profound structural irony at play here. The very room that was built to preserve the individual memory of one holy man is being completely consumed to preserve the collective memory of an entire global civilization. Throughout this entire exhausting process, the scholars maintain a meticulous ledger of what is being placed into the dark. They are not merely hiding books, they are deliberately curation and inheritance for the distant future. They include multiple copies of core dictionaries and multilingual glossaries, precious linguistic keys that they know will be absolutely essential if a future reader is to crack the codes of dead languages like Sogdian, Khotanese, or Tocharian. They include intimate personal journals, letters written by homesick soldiers stationed on the distant desert walls, and accounting books from local markets, recognizing that the true history of humanity is found not just in the grand pronouncements of kings, but in the ordinary, everyday struggles of common people. Every single document is placed into its specific slot with a gentle, lingering touch of the hand, a final, silent farewell from a class of men who know that their world is dying. As the final bundles are wedged into the remaining gaps near the ceiling, the air inside the small chamber becomes tight and thin, holding the concentrated aroma of 1,000 years of human intellect. The scholars stand back for a moment, their faces illuminated by the dying glow of their oil lamps, looking at the massive, packed mountain of paper that fills the space. They know that once the door is shut, no human eye will see these words again for a time that exceeds the lifespan of dynasties. They are casting their bread upon the waters of a dark, unpredictable ocean of time, gambling everything on the hope that the walls will hold, that the plaster will dry without cracking, and that the desert will keep their secret safe from the violent, short-sighted greed of the world outside. Let yourself rest now in the deep, heavy silence of that moment of completion. The chaotic world of political alliances and marching armies feels infinitely distant from the calm, timeless center of this cliffside sanctuary. The scholars have done everything within their limited human power to protect the intellectual treasure of their ancestors. They have woven a thick, invisible shield of secrecy around their library, preparing it to enter a state of deep hibernation that will outlast the memory of the very empires that currently threaten their gates. The stage is completely set for the final, irreversible act of concealment, the physical shutting of the door and the blending of the room into the decorated fabric of the cave wall. An act that will plunge these tens of thousands of vibrant human voices into a profound, uninterrupted sleep that will endure for a literal millennium. The deep, heavy silence that enveloped the completed stacks of manuscripts inside the small chapel now called for the final, irreversible act of craftsmanship. On a night when the desert moon was swallowed by a dense, low-hanging dust cloud, the small circle of scholars and master masons prepared to seal the entrance to Cave 17 forever. This was the moment where the long, intellectual labor of preservation ceased, and the structural work of total concealment began. The masons had brought with them several hundred heavy, sun-dried mud bricks, a type of material perfectly matched to the existing structural walls of the cave corridor. Working by the absolute minimum amount of light, the faint, flickering ember of a single hemp wick floating in oil, they began to lay the courses of brick across the narrow doorway. Each brick was set with meticulous care, the workers applying a thick, wet mortar made of local river silt and fine sand, ensuring that the new wall was perfectly flush with the ancient stone framing of the entrance. As the wall rose layer by layer, closing the narrow gap through which the light of the outside world could still peer, the air inside the manuscript chamber was cut off from the rest of the cave complex. The final brick was slid into place at the very top of the archway with a soft, dull scrape, sealing tens of thousands of delicate scrolls into an airtight vacuum. But the work was far from finished. The scholars knew that a raw, unadorned brick wall inside a beautifully decorated cave corridor would look immediately suspicious to any future intruder or inquisitive visitor. To make the concealment absolute, a master plasterer stepped forward with a large wooden bucket filled with a smooth, refined mixture of river mud, lime, and chopped straw. Moving with broad, deliberate strokes, he applied this plaster over the fresh brickwork, carefully feathering the edges where the new wall met the old, painted plaster of Cave 16. The plasterer worked with a level of precision that defied the immense anxiety of the moment. He had to ensure that when the wet mud dried, it would not shrink, crack, or leave a telling seam along the border of the hidden doorway. He used flat wooden floats to smooth out any imperfections, creating a surface that was completely indistinguishable from the rest of the long entry corridor. Once the plaster had settled into a firm, damp skin, the master artist of the monastery stepped into the narrow space. Holding a small earthenware palette filled with mineral pigments, earthy ochre, deep charcoal black, and a vibrant green ground from local malachite, he began to paint directly onto the drying wall, joining the new surface into the grand, visual narrative of the larger cave. The subject matter chosen for this deceptive fresco was a masterpiece of psychological misdirection. Instead of painting a dramatic cosmic scene that might draw prolonged attention, the artist replicated the pre-existing imagery of the cave corridor, depicting a wealthy, pious local benefactor who had funded the original excavation of the temple. Beside this figure, the artist drew the elegant, winding branches of a sacred tree, its leaves fluttering in a painted breeze, with a small, attentive attendant standing respectfully underneath. The style, the brush strokes, and the specific shades of color were executed with such flawless mimicry that the newly painted section blended perfectly into the surrounding murals. To an outside observer walking down the dark corridor, the wall appeared to be a continuous, uninterrupted piece of sacred art that had remained untouched for generations. The doorway had not merely been shut, it had completely vanished into the aesthetic fabric of the temple. To complete the illusion and ensure that the memory of the room was erased from the physical space, the scholars carefully moved the lifelike clay statue of the monk Hongbian back into the corridor. They placed the statue directly on a low pedestal situated right against the newly plastered wall, positioning it so that the holy man's back was turned toward the hidden entrance he had been chosen to guard. The statue, with its calm, contemplative expression and hands folded neatly within the sleeves of its painted robes, acted as a powerful physical and spiritual barrier. Any monk or pilgrim entering Cave 16 in the coming days would see only the familiar, revered figure of the deceased leader resting in his traditional place of honor, with no reason to suspect that just inches behind his clay shoulders lay a treasure house containing the intellectual inheritance of the entire Silk Road. When the work was finally completed in the early hours of the dawn, the scholars and artisans gathered their tools, carefully sweeping up every stray flake of dried plaster and every speck of brick dust from the floor of the cave. They walked out of the complex into the cool, sharp morning air of the Dunhuang River Valley, leaving the Mogao caves to sink back into their regular routine. No announcements were made. No records of the concealment were written down in the monastic logs. The secret was kept within the minds of a handful of men who understood that the survival of the knowledge depended entirely on their absolute silence. As the days turned into weeks, the wet plaster behind Hongbian's statue dried completely, hardening into a solid, stony shield that matched the ancient cliff face in temperature and texture. The timing of this concealment was nothing short of miraculous, a precise alignment of human desperation and natural geography. Shortly after the wall was painted, the political situation in the oasis fractured completely. The Tangut Empire launched a series of aggressive campaigns, seizing control of Dunhuang and restructuring the administrative and religious life of the region. Many of the older monastic lineages were displaced, and the grand traditions of multilingual translation that had thrived for centuries began to fade under the more rigid, centralized control of the new rulers. Because the scholars who had sealed the room either perished in the chaos or fled to distant provinces without passing on the secret, the knowledge of Cave 17's existence died with them. Within a single generation, the hidden room became a total myth, an invisible non-entity inside a sprawling complex of 500 painted chambers. The absolute silence that now settled over the hidden library was enhanced by the changing climate and geography of the region. As the centuries advanced, the great trade routes of the Silk Road began their final, irreversible decline. Ships built in the shipyards of southern China and Europe began to carry vast cargoes of silk, porcelain, and tea across the open oceans, rendering the dangerous, exhausting overland desert tracks obsolete. The wealth that had once flowed into Dunhuang like an unstoppable river slowly evaporated. The grand monasteries lost their funding, the population of scribes and translators dwindled to nothing, and the city itself shrank into a quiet, provincial agricultural outpost, forgotten by the imperial courts of the East and the grand capitals of the West. As human activity receded from the Mogao complex, nature began to build its own massive protective fortifications around the caves. The fierce winter winds that roared across the Taklamakan Desert carried millions of tons of fine, golden sand from the Mingsha dunes, dumping it directly into the Dunhuang River Valley. Because there were no longer hundreds of young monks and laborers to sweep the walkways every morning, the sand began to pile up against the base of the cliffs. Over decades, massive drifts of sand accumulated, completely burying the lower tiers of the cave complex under a heavy, protective blanket of earth. Cave 16, along with its secret side chamber, was slowly choked by the shifting dunes, its entrance partially blocked, and its interior plunged into a deep, perpetual twilight that protected it from the extreme fluctuations of the outside weather. Let yourself sink now into the profound, unshakable peace of this buried sanctuary as the first section of our journey drawing to a close. Inside the absolute blackness of Cave 17, time stood completely still. While empires rose and fell across the European and Asian continents, while grand cities were built and reduced to ashes, and while entirely new languages were born and forgotten, the tens of thousands of scrolls rested in perfect, dry stability. The yellow-dyed paper remained crisp. The black pine soot ink remained sharp. and the voices of the Christian mystics, Buddhist philosophers, Taoist sages, and ordinary desert merchants remained locked in an unbroken, millennium-long embrace of total silence, completely safe within the dark womb of the desert cliffside, waiting for an unpredictable morning in a distant future to wake them from their sleep. The long sleep of the hidden library inside the Mogao Cliffs was not measured by the ticking of clocks or the changing of seasons, but by the slow, majestic rise and fall of entire human civilizations outside its silent walls. For 10 complete centuries, a period of time that stretches far longer than the existence of most modern nations, the secret chamber remained completely decoupled from the chaotic stream of human history. When the final brick was laid in the early 11th century, Europe was still deeply fractured into small, feudal kingdoms. The grand empire of the Incas had not yet been conceived, and the printing press was a technology still waiting to be born in the distant future. As those decades slowly blended into centuries, the world outside the cave underwent a series of violent, earth-shattering transformations. Yet not a single echo of that global noise could penetrate the deep, stony silence of the hidden room. To comprehend the immense scale of this isolation, let us observe how the great empires of the world shifted and dissolved while the scrolls lay undisturbed in the dark. In the 13th century, the unstoppable horse archers of Genghis Khan roared across the Gobi Desert, their massive armies conquering Dunhuang and reshaping the entire political architecture of Asia. The Mongol rulers established the Yuan dynasty, briefly reopening the overland trade routes and allowing travelers like Marco Polo to pass through the region. Yet, even as foreign armies marched past the base of the cliffs and new administrative officers took up residence in the oasis city, no one ever suspected that just a few feet away from the public meditation halls of the Mogao complex lay an unlooted treasury of ancient thought. The painted fresco of the local benefactor and the sacred tree kept its silent guard, completely unblinking beneath the dust of passing centuries. As the centuries marched on, the geopolitical reality of the region shifted even further into deep isolation. The Ming dynasty built the westernmost terminus of the Great Wall at Jiayuguan, a massive fortress located a few days' journey to the east of Dunhuang. By doing so, the imperial court effectively drew a line in the sand, declaring everything beyond that gate to be a wild, lawless territory, unworthy of imperial protection. Dunhuang, once the proud, cosmopolitan gateway to China, was cast outside the wall, abandoned to the shifting whims of nature and local nomadic tribes. The irrigation canals that had fed the green fields for millennia began to collapse, their stone walls cracked by frost and choked by sand. The lush poplar groves withered away, and the grand city walls of Dunhuang slowly melted back into the mud brick dust from which they had been built. This profound human desertion was the ultimate protection for the hidden library. As the population of the oasis dwindled to a handful of isolated farmers and herders, the Mogao Caves ceased to be an active center of religious pilgrimage. The grand, multi-tiered wooden balconies that had once linked the 500 caves began to rot, their painted beams falling into the canyon below during fierce winter storms. The lower tiers of the complex were completely engulfed by the slow, inexorable movement of the Mingsha sand dunes. Millions of tons of fine, golden dust drifted against the cliff face, filling the entryways and sealing the lower sanctuaries in a natural vault of earth. Cave 16, along with its secret side chamber, was buried deep beneath this heavy desert blanket, its very existence erased from the active memory of the local inhabitants. Within this subterranean tomb, the environment achieved a state of absolute, unchanging perfection. The Taklamakan Desert, which had been a terrifying enemy to so many ancient travelers, turned into the ultimate curator of human thought. Because the region received almost zero rainfall, the air inside the sealed cave remained bone dry throughout the centuries. There was no moisture to encourage the growth of destructive mold, no dampness to cause the organic fibers of the paper to warp or decay. The natural yellow dye extracted from the Amur cork tree centuries earlier continued to perform its quiet chemical duty, keeping harmful insects at bay. The darkness was absolute, protecting the delicate mineral pigments of the illuminated manuscripts from the fading effects of sunlight. It was a space where time seemed to lose its teeth, a perfect vacuum where the 11th century was preserved completely intact. Let us reflect for a moment on the profound structural irony of this long isolation. During the very same centuries that the Dunhuang scrolls were sleeping in the dark, the Western world was desperately searching for the lost fragments of its own intellectual history. In Europe, the collapse of ancient libraries had left scholars with only tiny, distorted remnants of classical philosophy and early spiritual traditions. Wars, religious inquisitions, and accidental fires were systematically purging the great archives of Damascus, Baghdad, and Constantinople. Entire languages were dying out, and the delicate threads connecting modern humanity to its ancient roots were being snapped one by one. Yet here, on the forgotten fringe of the Gobi Desert, a pristine, comprehensive library containing the thoughts of a dozen dead civilizations was being kept perfectly safe, precisely because the world had forgotten it existed. The manuscripts themselves remained in the exact positions where the ancient scholars had placed them on that final, anxious night. The long scrolls of the Lotus Sutra lay tucked into their woven grass mats. The Syriac liturgies of the Christian mystics remained nestled against the multicolored hymns of the Manichaean sages, and the private letters of long-dead soldiers and merchants held their intimate secrets in the dark. They were like seeds buried deep within the frozen soil of winter, holding the entire genetic code of an ancient, tolerant world within their fragile structures, waiting for a morning that must have seemed as though it would never arrive. The statues of the clay Buddhas and the quiet figure of Hung Bien kept their lonely vigil in the dark corridor, their painted eyes staring into the blackness, completely unbothered by the passage of 1,000 years. As the 19th century drew toward its close, the modern world began to stretch its long, industrial fingers back toward the heart of Central Asia. The great European empires, Great Britain and Imperial Russia, engaged in a tense shadow conflict for geopolitical dominance known as the Great Game. Mapping expeditions, military surveyors, and adventurous geographers began to cross the high passes of the Pamir Mountains and navigate the arid basins of the desert, looking for trade routes, mineral wealth, and archaeological remains. The long isolation of the Silk Road was coming to an end. The desert, which had kept its secrets so fiercely for a millennium, was about to be breached by an entirely new class of human beings, men who carried notebooks, cameras, and a consuming hunger for historical truth. Let yourself rest now in the deep, heavy twilight of this final century of silence. The desert wind is blowing softly outside the buried entrance of Cave 16, carrying with it the cool, sharp air of a Gobi night. Inside the hidden chamber, the air is perfectly still, holding the faint, ancient scent of pine soot ink and dried mulberry bark. The tens of thousands of scrolls remain completely unaware that the world outside has changed beyond recognition, that railroads are being built across continents, and that the long, dark night of their concealment is drawing to its inevitable close. The stage is being quietly set for the accidental moment of discovery, an event that will shatter the silence of 1,000 years and unleash these ancient voices back into the modern world, changing our understanding of human history forever. The grand, millennium-long silence of the Mogao Cliffs was shattered not by an official scientific expedition or a team of highly educated imperial archaeologists, but by the quiet, accidental curiosity of a single, impoverished human being. In the final years of the 19th century, a lonely, eccentric Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu arrived at the abandoned complex of the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas. Wang was not a scholar. He was a wandering veteran of the army who had left behind the violent chaos of civil rebellion to seek a life of quiet spiritual devotion. When he looked at the sprawling, dilapidated labyrinth of hand-carved cliffside sanctuaries, he did not see a historical monument of global significance. Instead, he saw a sacred space that had been tragically defiled by centuries of neglect, choked by immense mountains of golden desert sand and abandoned to the wild animals. With a pure, unyielding sense of religious duty, he decided to make the restoration of these sacred caves his life's solitary mission. Moving into the dark, cavernous interior of Cave 16, Wang Yuanlu found himself confronting a massive wall of drifted sand that had accumulated over generations, completely blocking the entry corridor and burying the lower paintings. Armed with nothing but a simple wooden shovel, a woven wicker basket, and an iron will, he spent months engaging in a slow, exhausting battle against the desert elements. Day after day, working by the dim, warm light of a single oil lamp, he carried out thousands of basketfuls of fine sand, slowly reclaiming the ancient architectural geometry of the temple hall. He worked in absolute isolation, the rhythmic, hollow scrape of his wooden shovel against the floor providing the only heartbeat for the silent valley of the Dunhuang River. He had no funding, no helpers, and no understanding of the immense civilizational inheritance that was hiding just inches away from his blistered hands. The fateful morning arrived on the 26th of May in the year 1900. Wang Yuanlu, along with a temporary laborer he had hired to help clear the remaining heavy drifts from the entry corridor, was working deep within the shadows of Cave 16. As they cleared away the final layers of packed sand near the base of the wall, the laborer noticed a peculiar structural anomaly that had been hidden for 10 centuries. The wet plaster that Wang was using to wash the walls seemed to dry with an uneven patchiness over a specific section of the fresco. Intrigued, the laborer tapped his wooden shovel handle against the painted surface, depicting the local wealthy benefactor and the sacred tree. Instead of the dull, solid thud of the living gravel cliffside, the wall returned a hollow, resonant ring, a clear acoustic signal that a hidden, empty space lay directly behind the plaster. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and a sudden spike of superstitious anxiety, Wang Yuanlu took an iron pick and carefully cracked the centuries-old painted surface. As the brittle plaster fell away in large, dust-covered flakes, it revealed the deliberate courses of sun-dried mud bricks that had been laid by the ancient masons 1,000 years earlier. Wang worked with a racing heart, removing the bricks one by one from the narrow archway. When the final brick near the top of the opening was slid out, a small, dark aperture was formed, and a sudden, cold gust of ancient compressed air rushed out of the darkness, blowing out the flame of their solitary candle. It was an air that smelled heavily of dried mulberry bark, ancient pine soot, and the deep, unchanged stillness of the 11th century. A physical breath from a forgotten world that had been sealed before the rise of modern nations. When Wang Yuanlu struck a match and peered through the narrow opening into the pitch-black interior of Cave 17, he found himself looking at a sight that completely defied his limited understanding of reality. The small, 9-foot square chamber was packed from the floor to the curved ceiling with an immense, solid mountain of tightly packed, cloth-wrapped bundles. There were no chests of gold coins, no glittering jewels, and no sacred weapons of ancient kings. There was only paper, tens of thousands of long, rolled scrolls, neatly cataloged and stacked in tight, orderly rows that filled the entire space. The lifelike clay statue of the monk Hong Bian, which had been moved out into the corridor centuries earlier, sat nearby, its serene eyes watching the dark opening as if its ancient vigil had finally come to its structural conclusion. The accidental discovery of this secret room created a profound psychological crisis for the simple Taoist caretaker. Wang Yuanlu realized that he had uncovered something of immense value, but he had no way of knowing that he was holding the intellectual key to the lost history of Asia. He picked up a few sample scrolls from the very top of the stack, carefully unrolling them by the light of his lantern. He saw columns of flawless, elegant Chinese calligraphy, vibrant mineral paintings of flying deities, and rows of mysterious, spidery alphabets that he could not read. Wang was a deeply religious man, and his immediate instinct was to protect these texts from harm. He carefully bricked the opening back up, leaving the mountain of paper to sink back into the dark, while he tried to figure out what to do with his incredible secret. Over the next few years, Wang Yuanlu attempted to alert the local provincial officials to the existence of the hidden library, hoping that the imperial government would provide the funds necessary to secure the collection and transport it to the capital. He loaded a few precious manuscripts onto the back of a donkey and traveled across the burning desert dunes to the office of the local governor, presenting the scrolls as evidence of his discovery. However, the dying Qing dynasty was currently fracturing under the weight of foreign invasions, internal rebellions, and total economic bankruptcy. The officials viewed the ancient papers with a mixture of bureaucratic indifference and mild academic curiosity. They praised Wang for his find, but told him that the government had no money to spare for old scrolls. They ordered him to simply brick the room back up and remain at his post as the solitary caretaker of the caves. Frustrated by the official indifference and desperately needing money to fund his restoration work on the main temples, Wang Yuanlu began to use the secret library as a source of private spiritual currency. He would occasionally open the hidden door and select a beautifully written scroll to give as a prestigious gift to local wealthy merchants, military commanders, or visiting calligraphers who expressed an interest in ancient artifacts. In return, these benefactors would provide small donations of silver coins, which Wang used to buy paint, repair the collapsing wooden facades of the caves, and build a massive, three-tiered wooden pagoda over the grand statue of the Buddha. The sacred archive, which had been hidden so fiercely to protect it from the greed of men, was now being slowly leaked back into the world, one scroll at a time, to pay for the physical upkeep of the very cliffside that had served as its sanctuary. Let yourself rest now in the quiet, suspenseful atmosphere of this historical transition point. The great secret of the Mogao Caves was no longer absolute. The invisible shield of total oblivion that had protected the library for 10 centuries had been breached by a single iron pick, and a narrow shaft of modern light was now cutting through the perpetual twilight of Cave 17. The tens of thousands of ancient scrolls remained stacked in their tight, silent rows, their yellow-dyed fibers still crisp and their black ink still sharp. Yet the peaceful isolation of their long winter sleep was gone forever. Rumors of a massive, hidden cave filled with thousands of ancient books were beginning to drift out of the desert oasis, traveling along the new telegraph lines and trade routes, destined to reach the ears of a completely new class of human beings, global explorers who were already packing their bags for a frantic scramble into the heart of Asia. The delicate rumor of a massive, ancient library hidden within the sand-choked cliffs of Dunhuang did not remain confined to the dusty marketplaces of the oasis for long, as it soon reached the ears of a new breed of Western explorers who were combing Central Asia in search of the lost footprints of humanity. The first of these global investigators to breach the sanctuary of the Mogao Caves was Aurel Stein, a brilliant, relentlessly determined Hungarian-British archaeologist and geographer who was working under the auspices of the British Museum and the Government of India. Stein was a master of desert travel, a man who possessed a deep, encyclopedic understanding of the ancient Silk Road routes and an unshakable belief that the dry sands of the Taklamakan held the missing chapters of world history. In the spring of 1907, after navigating his caravan through weeks of punishing dust storms, he finally arrived at the base of the Mingsha Dunes, his eyes fixed on the multi-tiered cliffside where the secret room lay waiting. Upon his arrival, Stein quickly recognized that the ultimate key to accessing the hidden library was not an iron pick or an imperial shovel, but the trust and cooperation of the simple Taoist caretaker, Wang Yuanlu. Wang was naturally suspicious of foreign travelers, fearing that these strange men with their notebooks and cameras would defile the sacred temples he had spent years restoring with his own blistered hands. Stein, moving with an extraordinary level of diplomatic patience and psychological insight, did not demand immediate entry to the hidden chamber. Instead, he camped near the riverbed, spent days admiring the painted frescoes of the grand public halls, and engaged Wang in long, respectful conversations about the history of the site. Stein discovered that Wang held a deep, almost childlike reverence for Xuanzang, the legendary 7th century Chinese Buddhist monk who had traveled to India to gather sacred scriptures. By casting himself as a humble disciple of Xuanzang, who had retraced the master's footsteps from India to Dunhuang, Stein successfully dismantled the caretaker's emotional defenses. On a tense, moonless night, when the rest of the oasis had fallen into deep slumber, Wang Yuanlu quietly led Stein and his trusted Chinese assistant, Jiang Xiaowan, down the narrow, sand-cleared entry corridor of Cave 16. With a hesitant, trembling hand, Wang opened the wooden door of Cave 17, allowing the warm glow of a single kerosene lantern to cut through the perpetual twilight of the small side chamber. As the light flickered across the interior, Stein stood absolutely frozen in astonishment, his heart racing as he looked at the massive, packed mountain of paper bundles that filled the room from the floor to the curved ceiling. He picked up a few sample scrolls, his practiced, scholarly eyes instantly recognizing the crisp texture of early medieval paper and the elegant calligraphy of ancient dynasties that had vanished 1,000 years earlier. It was an archaeological miracle of unparalleled proportions, a complete, pristine time capsule of human thought that had remained entirely untouched by the ravages of war or nature. What followed over the next several weeks was a quiet, agonizingly intense negotiation conducted in the deep shadows of the cave. Stein knew that he could not simply seize the collection without provoking a violent backlash from the local community, nor could he afford to buy the entire mountain of scrolls due to his limited budget. Instead, he systematically examined the bundles, relying on the tireless assistance of Jiang Xiaowan to sift through the classical Chinese characters and identify the rarest, most historically significant documents. Wang Yuanlu, constantly torn between his religious duty to protect the texts and his desperate need for financial resources to fund his ongoing temple restoration projects, agreed to let Stein purchase a substantial selection of the manuscripts in exchange for a modest donation of silver pieces. Night after night, secret shipments of ancient papers were packed into heavy wooden crates, loaded onto the backs of Stein's camels, and covered with ordinary blankets to evade the eyes of local provincial officials. When Stein finally departed from Dunhuang, his caravan carried away an immense treasure that would fundamentally rewrite the cultural history of Asia. Thousands of complete manuscripts, including the world's oldest dated printed book, the magnificent Diamond Sutra from the year 868, along with exquisite paintings on silk and hemp, rare administrative records, and multilingual texts that had not been read by a living soul for a millennium. Yet, the global scramble for the Dunhuang treasures had only just begun. Just 1 year later, in 1908, a brilliant young French sinologist named Paul Pelliot arrived at the Mogao Caves. Unlike Stein, Pelliot was a master of classical Chinese, a man who could read ancient texts with the fluid speed of a native scholar. Pelliot spent 3 weeks locked inside the dark, claustrophobic interior of Cave 17, working for hours by the light of a single candle, sorting through the remaining tens of thousands of scrolls at an astonishing pace. He picked out the finest remaining linguistic gems, rare Christian and Manichaean fragments, and unique historical journals, purchasing them from Wang Yuanlu for an equally modest sum of silver before shipping them back to Paris. As the news of these spectacular acquisitions rippled through the academic circles of St. Petersburg, Tokyo, and Beijing, other foreign expeditions rushed toward the oasis, each anxious to claim a piece of the crumbling desert archive. The Japanese explorer Otani Kozui and the Russian scholar Sergei Oldenburg launched their own fast-paced expeditions to Dunhuang, gathering thousands of additional manuscript fragments and painted textiles for the museums of their respective empires. By the time the central government in Beijing finally realized the true, irreplaceable value of what was being lost and ordered the remaining contents of Cave 17 to be secured and transported to the capital, the hidden library had been systematically dispersed across the globe. The single, unified archive that a secret society of ancient scholars had hidden so fiercely to protect from the fires of war was now scattered across London, Paris, St. Petersburg, Tokyo, and Beijing, its fragments divided by modern borders and locked behind the glass display cases of rival institutions. This global dispersion of the Dunhuang manuscripts represents a profound, bittersweet twist in the narrative of preservation. On one hand, the ancient texts were permanently removed from the immediate physical environment that had kept them safe for 1,000 years, their original context fractured and their bundles torn apart by the clinical hands of foreign curators. On the other hand, by entering the great research universities and national libraries of the modern world, these fragile pieces of paper were granted a new form of digital immortality. They were subjected to the highest standards of modern conservation science, their delicate fibers stabilized, their inks preserved, and their words meticulously translated into dozens of modern languages. The long-dead voices of the desert merchants, the Persian Christian monks, the Buddhist philosophers, and the ordinary scribes were no longer trapped in the absolute blackness of a hollowed-out cliffside. They were unleashed back into the global consciousness, forcing humanity to confront a far more complex, beautiful, and pluralistic vision of its own past. Let yourself rest now in the quiet, reflective stillness of this historical transition, as the frantic era of discovery and dispersion begins to settle back into a deeper rhythm of understanding. The empty space inside Cave 17 stood open once more, its mountain of paper gone, leaving behind only the quiet clay statue of the monk Hong Bian to look upon the bare stone walls that had served as a fortress of knowledge for 10 centuries. The chaotic scramble of the modern explorers had passed through the valley like a sudden, fierce windstorm, leaving the ancient Mogao caves to sink back into the eternal, steady silence of the Gobi night. The manuscripts themselves had embarked on an entirely new journey across the oceans, preparing to reveal their secrets to a world that was finally ready to listen, while the shifting sand dunes outside continued their slow, rhythmic dance over the ancient cliffs, keeping a silent vigil over the cradle of a forgotten civilization. The departure of the heavily laden camel caravans from the gates of Dunhuang did not mark the end of the Hidden Library's story. Rather, it signaled the beginning of its true resurrection. In the decades that followed that grand global dispersal, the quiet canyon of the Dunhuang River underwent a slow, magnificent transformation from a forgotten graveyard of ancient monuments into an international sanctuary of historical memory. Today, the Mogao caves are no longer buried under mountains of drifted sand, nor are they left to the solitary care of a single impoverished hermit. They have been recognized by our modern world as a priceless treasure of universal human heritage, a sacred space where the highest artistic and spiritual achievements of a dozen dead civilizations are protected with the most sophisticated tools of contemporary science. Yet, as we stand in the quiet shadows of these ancient cliffside temples today, we can still feel the profound, unshakable peace that allowed a mountain of fragile paper to survive 1,000 years of total oblivion. The physical trace of this incredible story remains beautifully visible within the quiet geometry of the caves themselves. If you walk down the modern wooden walkways of the Mogao complex on a cool evening, past the rows of carved wooden doors that now protect the painted sanctuaries, you can still enter the vast vaulted hall of Cave 16. Inside, the walls are still covered with the faded, beautiful images of the seated Buddhas, their robes painted in soft earth tones that have resisted the passage of 16 centuries. And if you turn your head toward the entrance corridor, you can look directly into the tiny 9-foot square alcove known to the world as Cave 17. The room is entirely empty now, its massive mountain of cloth-wrapped bundles gone, leaving only the bare, plaster-covered stone walls exposed to the gentle light. Yet, the atmosphere inside is still incredibly thick, holding the faint, ghostly resonance of those frantic nights when a small society of ancient scholars stacked their most precious books against the ceiling, gambling everything on the silence of the desert. The beautiful clay statue of the monk Hongbian, which had been moved out into the corridor centuries earlier to make room for the scrolls, has been returned to its original place of honor inside Cave 17. The holy leader sits upon his low platform, his hands folded neatly within the painted sleeves of his robes, his serene, sculpted eyes looking calmly across the empty space toward the doorway. It is a sight of profound, structural closure. The statue, which had its back turned to the secret for 10 centuries, now serves as the permanent guardian of an empty room, a silent witness to a creative miracle that has already been accomplished. The painted fresco of the local benefactor and the sacred tree, which had been cracked open by Wang Yuanlu's iron pick on that fateful morning in 1900, has been meticulously restored by modern conservators, its smooth surface blending once more into the surrounding murals, keeping the architectural memory of the concealment alive. But the true, living legacy of Dunhuang is found not in the empty stone chamber of the cliffside, but in the magnificent digital network that has reunified this scattered archive across the borders of the modern world. Through a monumental international collaboration known as the International Dunhuang Project, the thousands of fragile scrolls that were once carried away to London, Paris, St. Petersburg, Tokyo, and Beijing are being painstakingly reunited in virtual space. Every single scrap of yellow-dyed paper, every line of elegant Chinese calligraphy, and every spidery character of dead languages like Sogdian and Khotanese has been photographed in ultra-high resolution and made available to scholars and seekers across the globe. The walls of division that were built by 19th century imperial competition have been dissolved by the fluid connectivity of the digital era, allowing the universal archive of the Silk Road to become an open, flowing fountain of knowledge for all of mankind once more. When modern linguists and historians unroll these digital scrolls today, they find themselves looking into a mirror that completely reshapes our understanding of the human past. The texts have revealed that the ancient world was infinitely more interconnected, tolerant, and intellectually sophisticated than our standard history textbooks had ever dared to suggest. We now know that long before Europe entered its age of global exploration, the oasis of Dunhuang was operating as a vast, cosmopolitan brain, a place where different world religions did not view each other through the distorted lens of fear and conflict, but as companions in a shared, difficult journey through the desert of existence. The scrolls have shown us that languages we once considered completely isolated were actively borrowing words and concepts from one another, building intellectual bridges across the geographical chasms of Asia, and creating a shared vocabulary of human seeking that belonged to no single empire. Let us sit with the magnificent, quiet weight of this philosophical realization as the deep peace of the night settles over your mind. The story of the secret society of scholars who saved human knowledge in the caves of Dunhuang is not merely a chronicle of old papers and forgotten dates. It is a profound, timeless lesson in the ultimate endurance of the human spirit. It reminds us that even in the darkest eras of historical chaos, when empires are fracturing and the fires of fanaticism are burning at the gates, there will always be a small group of dedicated souls who will choose to care for the intellect. These men did not possess armies or weapons. They had nothing but a collection of wolf hair brushes, a few blocks of pine soot ink, and a deep, unconditional reverence for the written word. Yet, by executing their quiet labor of love in absolute secrecy, they proved that a fragile piece of paper, hidden within the silent heart of a desert cliffside, can outlast the iron swords of the greatest conquering kings on earth. As our long journey through time draws to its inevitable conclusion tonight, let the hurried pace of the modern world completely dissolve from your thoughts, matching your breath to the immense, slow rhythm of the shifting sands outside. Imagine the silent valley of the Mogao Caves as it rests under a vast canopy of brilliant desert stars. The Dunhuang River is flowing softly over its smooth stones, its gentle, watery murmur providing a steady heartbeat for the sleeping cliffs. The fierce windstorms that once scoured the ridges of the Mingsha dunes have died down, leaving the golden sand to settle into smooth, untouched waves that glow softly under the pale light of the moon. The 500 painted chambers are completely dark now, their clay statues of the serene Buddhas and flying celestial beings resting in the cool, protective shadows of the mountain, their ancient vigilance entirely at peace. The long night of the desert is deep, safe, and completely undisturbed. The tens of thousands of ancient voices that were buried so fiercely in the dark have already spoken to us. Their messages of tolerance, wisdom, and human connection delivered safely across 1,000 years into our waiting hands. They have fulfilled their sacred destiny of preservation, and they now give us permission to let go of our daily anxieties, to release the heavy burdens of the day, and to sink into the quiet, comforting embrace of total stillness. Listen one final time to the soft, distant whistling of the wind over the ancient stone, a gentle lullaby that has watched over the cradle of human knowledge for a millennium, inviting you to close your eyes, to trust in the steady, unchanging turning of the earth, and to drift away into a deep, peaceful, and unbroken sleep.